every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. It is Friday, March 15, 2019. In Christchurch, New Zealand, the early autumn air is crisp. It is just after 1:30 in the afternoon. Inside the Al-Noor Mosque on Deans Avenue, the atmosphere is one of serenity and devotion. Hundreds of worshippers are gathered for Jumu'ah, the Friday prayer, a cornerstone of the Islamic faith. It is a time for community, for reflection, and for peace. Among the congregation are doctors, refugees, fathers, children, and grandfathers. They are the fabric of modern New Zealand, a nation that prides itself on safety, tolerance, and distance from the turbulent violence that seems to plague the rest of the world. But that distance is about to be proven an illusion. Approaching the mosque is a Subaru Outback. Inside sits a 28-year-old Australian man. He is not just a gunman. He is a content creator. He is not just preparing for murder. He is preparing for a broadcast. Strapped to his chest is a GoPro camera. On the passenger seat beside him are high-powered semi-automatic rifles covered in white writing, names, dates, and slogans drawn from history and the darkest corners of the internet. He checks his connection. He opens an app. He begins a live stream on Facebook. In a few moments, the silence of the prayer will be shattered, and the world will witness a new, terrifying evolution in the anatomy of terrorism. This was not merely an attack on a building or a group of people. It was an attack designed for the digital age, scripted for virality, and engineered to turn a massacre into a meme. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we are dissecting the Christchurch mosque shootings. We are not just looking at the timeline of violence, but at the specific anatomy of online radicalization and live-streamed terror. We will explore how a gym trainer from Grafton, New South Wales, descended into a rabbit hole of algorithmic hate, how he weaponized the very infrastructure of the internet to amplify his message, and how a nation responded when the illusion of safety was permanently broken. To understand the anatomy of this crime, we must first dissect the perpetrator, Brenton Tarrant. But unlike traditional criminal profiling, which looks for childhood trauma or a history of violent outbursts, Tarrant's profile is one of modern digital isolation. Born in Australia to a working-class family, his early life was unremarkable. He worked as a personal trainer. He was described by former clients as disciplined and polite, though somewhat intense. However, following the death of his father and a subsequent inheritance, Tarrant began to travel. Between 2012 and 2018, he visited dozens of countries, including North Korea, Pakistan, and various nations across Europe and the Balkans. It is during this period of transient existence that the psychological shift occurred. He was not radicalized in a training camp in the desert. He was radicalized in the boundless, unmoderated spaces of the internet and through a warped interpretation of history observed during his travels. The ideology that consumed him is known as the Great Replacement Theory. This is a white nationalist conspiracy theory which claims that white European populations are being systematically replaced by non-European peoples, specifically through mass migration and demographic growth, often alleged to be orchestrated by a secretive global elite. While this theory has historical roots in early 20th century nativism, it has found a potent new life in online subcultures. Tarrant became obsessed with the idea that Western civilization was collapsing. He fixated on terrorist attacks in Europe, specifically the 2017 truck attack in Stockholm, viewing them not as isolated tragedies, but as battles in a civilizational war. His worldview became binary and apocalyptic. In his mind, he was not a terrorist. He was a partisan soldier fighting a defensive war against invaders. This cognitive reframing is essential to the anatomy of his radicalization. It allowed him to bypass the natural human inhibition against killing innocents by stripping them of their humanity and recategorizing them as enemy combatants in a grand historical struggle. This radicalization was fed by the echo chambers of image boards like 8chan and 4chan. These platforms are critical to understanding the specific anatomy of this crime. Unlike mainstream social media, these unmoderated forums operate on a unique cultural currency: transgression, irony, and shock value. In these spaces, extreme racism and calls for violence are often wrapped in layers of irony and memes, a tactic known as shitposting. This creates an environment where hate speech is gamified. Users compete for engagement through increasingly extreme content. Tarrant was not just a passive consumer of this content, he was a product of it. His manifesto, released minutes before the attack, was titled The Great Replacement, but stylistically, it was a chaotic mix of serious political diatribe and internet trolling. It contained copypasta, or copy and pasted blocks of text, inside jokes, and references to video games and YouTubers. This was a deliberate strategic choice. By mixing horror with absurdity, he aimed to confuse the media narrative and signal to his in-group online that he was one of them. The planning of the attack reveals a meticulous, almost sterile attention to detail, characteristic of someone who views violence as a logistical problem to be solved. He moved to Dunedin, New Zealand in 2017. He chose New Zealand specifically because it was considered a low-target environment, aiming to prove that nowhere was safe. He joined a gun club. He practiced shooting. He acquired a firearms license legally, exploiting gaps in the vetting process that relied on police interviews, which failed to detect his extremist views because he had no criminal record and presented a facade of normalcy. He purchased semi-automatic rifles, including an AR-15 style weapon and a Ruger Mini 14. He then modified these weapons. He purchased high-capacity magazines, which were technically restricted but easily obtained through loopholes in the law at the time. The writing on the weapons is a forensic artifact in itself. He covered the magazines and stocks with white paint, scrawling the names of historical figures who fought against the Ottoman Empire, right-wing terrorists, and dates of battles. These weapons were not just tools of murder, they were totems, covered in the iconography of his distorted history. On the morning of March 15th, the anatomy of the attack shifted from planning to execution. The primary target was the Al-Noor Mosque. Tarrant sent his manifesto to the Prime Minister's office, media outlets, and various politicians minutes before the attack. This was not a warning intended to stop the event. It was a publicity blast to ensure the context of his violence was established. Before the authorities could control the narrative, he then posted a link to his live stream on 8chan with the chilling message, "Well, lads, it's time to stop shitposting, and time to make a real-life effort post." This language is significant. In internet parlance, an effort post is a contribution that takes significant time and energy. He was framing the mass murder of human beings as a content contribution to an internet forum. The live stream itself is the most distinct and horrifying anatomical feature of this case. He mounted a GoPro to his helmet. The angle of the camera was deliberate. It mimicked the visual perspective of a first-person shooter video game. This was a psychological weapon. It was designed to appeal to the desensitized, gaming-literate youth of the far-right subculture. It distanced the viewer from the reality of the pain, turning the victims into non-player characters or NPCs in a perverse game. As he drove to the mosque, he played a Serbian nationalist song from the 1990s wars, forcing a soundtrack onto the carnage. He arrived at Al-Noor Mosque at approximately 1:40 p.m. He parked in a neighboring driveway to ensure a quick exit. He exited the vehicle, armed with a semi-automatic shotgun and the AR-15. As he walked toward the entrance, he was greeted by a worshiper who said, "Hello, brother." These were likely the last words the man spoke. Tarrant opened fire. The anatomy of the next 6 minutes is a blur of calculated brutality. He moved through the mosque with tactical precision, firing into corners where people huddled for safety. He returned to his car to switch weapons, discarding one and retrieving another before re-entering the mosque to ensure maximum lethality. The live stream broadcasted every second of this to the world. Algorithms on social media platforms, designed to maximize engagement, initially struggled to contain the footage. It was copied, re-uploaded, and shared millions of times before it could be scrubbed. The killer had successfully hijacked the global information infrastructure. Inside the mosque, amidst the horror, there were profound acts of heroism that defy the killer's nihilistic worldview. Naeem Rashid, a teacher originally from Pakistan, saw the gunman. Instead of fleeing, Rashid launched himself at Tarrant, attempting to tackle him. He was shot and fatally wounded, but his action likely disrupted the attacker's rhythm and bought precious seconds for others to escape. This anatomy of courage acts as a direct counter-narrative to the killer's anatomy of hate. Rashid was later posthumously awarded the New Zealand Cross, the country's highest award for bravery. Leaving 44 dead at Al-Noor, Tarrant returned to his vehicle and drove fast toward his second target, the Linwood Islamic Center. The drive took roughly 12 minutes. During this transit, he fired at pedestrians and talked to the camera, expressing frustration that his original plan to burn down the mosque had not been executed. This commentary reinforces the performative nature of the crime. He was constantly narrating his own atrocity. At the Linwood Islamic Center, the anatomy of the attack changed. Tarrant could not find the main entrance immediately. He began shooting through a window. However, at Linwood, he faced immediate and effective resistance. Abdul Aziz, a worshipper, picked up a credit card machine, the only object he could find, and ran outside screaming at the gunman to draw his attention away from the others. Tarrant fired at Aziz but missed. Aziz then picked up a discarded rifle that Tarrant had dropped. It was empty. When Tarrant went to his car to get another weapon, Aziz threw the empty rifle at the gunman's windshield, shattering it. This act of defiance spooked Tarrant. Believing he was under fire or that the police were imminent, he fled the scene. Aziz's bravery undoubtedly saved dozens of lives. 7 people were killed at Linwood, but the toll could have been much higher. The police response was rapid, but the chaos of the situation meant information was fragmented. The anatomy of the takedown, however, is a textbook example of police courage. 2 rural community police officers, Senior Constable Jim Manning and Senior Constable Scott Carmody, were in the area for a training session. They heard the radio calls. They were armed only with Glock pistols, while the suspect was known to have high-powered semi-automatics. They spotted the suspect's vehicle on Brome Street, in a maneuver that violated standard safety protocol, but was necessary given the imminent threat. They rammed the gunman's car, sending it mounting onto the curb. With the suspect's car disabled, the officers exited their vehicle. The gunman was still inside, potentially reaching for his weapons or explosives, as he had claimed to have rigged the car. The officers approached with weapons drawn. They dragged Tarrant from the vehicle. One officer subdued him, while the other covered them. On the sidewalk of a busy Christchurch road, The rampage ended. Tarrant looked at the officers and complained that they had ruined his plan to travel to a third location, a mosque in the town of Ashburton. The immediate aftermath dissected the soul of New Zealand. The nation was in shock. 51 people were dead, 40 more were injured. The victims hailed from across the Muslim world: Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Turkey, Somalia, Afghanistan, and others. They included a 3-year-old boy, Muqad Ibrahim, and a 71-year-old grandfather, Daud Nabi, who had welcomed the gunman at the door. The forensic investigation that followed was one of the largest in New Zealand's history. Crime scene investigators had to catalog thousands of bullet fragments, map the trajectory of every shot, and process the digital mountain of evidence Tarrant had left behind. But the anatomy of this case extends beyond the crime scene tape into the halls of government and the court of public opinion. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern's response became a defining feature of the event. She refused to speak the killer's name. He sought many things from his act of terror, but one was notoriety, she told Parliament. And that is why you will never hear me mention his name. This was a strategic, psychological countermove. By denying him the fame he craved, she attempted to suffocate his ideology. She centered the narrative entirely on the victims, famously donning a hijab and telling the Muslim community, "We are one. They are us." This phrase became a rallying cry, dissecting the us versus them narrative the killer tried to impose and replacing it with radical inclusion. Simultaneously, the legislative anatomy shifted with unprecedented speed. New Zealand's gun laws were permissive by international standards. Within days of the attack, the government announced a ban on most semi-automatic weapons. The Arms Amendment Bill was passed by Parliament with a vote of 119 to 1 less than a month after the shooting. A buyback scheme was implemented, resulting in over 50,000 firearms being handed in. This rapid legislative action stands in stark contrast to the paralysis often seen in other jurisdictions following mass shootings. It demonstrated a political will to physically remove the tools of the crime from society. The legal proceedings were another critical component of the case's anatomy. Tarrant initially pleaded not guilty, raising fears that he would use the trial as a platform to spew his ideology, much like Anders Breivik had done in Norway. The court prepared for a spectacle. Strict suppression orders were put in place to prevent his manifesto from being broadcast. However, in a surprise turn in March 2020, amidst the quiet of the COVID-19 lockdown, Tarrant changed his plea to guilty on all charges: 51 counts of murder, 40 counts of attempted murder, and 1 count of engaging in a terrorist act. The sentencing hearing in August 2020 was a grueling 4-day process. It provided the victims and their families the opportunity to address the killer directly. This is a crucial part of the anatomy of justice, the restoration of voice to the victim. 91 victim impact statements were read. Some were angry, some were weeping, and some offered forgiveness. Jana Izat, whose son Hussein was killed, looked at Tarrant and said, "I decided to forgive you because I don't have hate. I don't have revenge." Tarrant, who had remained stone-faced and emotionless throughout, appeared visibly twitchy at this offering of grace. It was a weapon he had no defense against. The judge, Justice Cameron Mander, delivered a sentence that made legal history in New Zealand. He sentenced Tarrant to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This marked the first time in New Zealand's history that a prisoner had been given no hope of release. Justice Mander's remarks dissected the killer's character with surgical precision, calling his actions inhuman, merciless, and driven by a warped, malignant ideology. He told Tarrant, "You are empty of any empathy for your victims." The sentence ensured that the killer would die in prison, denied the platform and the freedom he sought to destroy in others. However, dissecting the Christchurch shootings requires us to look at the anatomy of online radicalization that persists long after the cell door has slammed shut. The Royal Commission of Inquiry, released in late 2020, found that while intelligence agencies had been focused heavily on Islamic extremism, they had largely overlooked the rising threat of right-wing white nationalism. Tarrant had operated in plain sight, but in a digital spectrum the authorities were not adequately monitoring. He had donated money to identitarian groups in Austria. He had communicated with other extremists. But because these interactions happened in the chaotic, high-volume noise of 8chan and gaming servers, red flags were missed. The role of the live stream remains the most chilling legacy of the case. The Christchurch Call, an initiative launched by Ardern and French President Emmanuel Macron, sought to bring governments and tech companies together to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content online. It highlighted the responsibility of platforms like Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, now X, in preventing their algorithms from becoming distribution networks for mass murder. Yet, the video of the shooting continues to circulate in the dark corners of the web. It has inspired copycats. Shootings in Poway, California, El Paso, Texas, and Buffalo, New York, all featured perpetrators who cited Tarrant or used his manifesto as a template. This demonstrates the viral nature of the anatomy of this crime. The methodology itself is contagious. The psychological profile of the digital native terrorist is one of the most disturbing findings of this dissection. Tarrant was not a lone wolf in the traditional sense. He was part of a pack that lived in the cloud. He sought validation from a peer group he had never met in person. The gamification of the violence, the scoreboard of kills, the first-person camera angle, the inside jokes, suggests a dissociation where the line between digital fantasy and physical reality is obliterated. For the radicalized individual, the violence becomes a performative act to gain status within the online subculture. The victims are dehumanized twice, first by the ideology that marks them as enemies, and second by the medium that reduces them to pixels on a screen. We must also examine the anatomy of the weapons themselves. The AR-15 platform is the weapon of choice for these attacks, not just because of its lethality, but because of its cultural symbolism in the right-wing sphere. Tarrant's modification of the weapons was illegal, but the base platforms were legal. The ease with which he obtained a license, having two referees, who were essentially online gaming friends, vouch for him, exposed a systemic failure in the vetting process. The anatomy of a loophole allowed a man with no genuine community ties and a head full of hate to arm himself with military-grade firepower. The forensic aftermath involved not just ballistics, but digital forensics. Investigators had to scrape the internet to find every trace of his planning. They found that he had used drones to conduct surveillance on the Al-Noor Mosque weeks before the attack. He had studied the layout, the prayer times, and the exits. This was a premeditated military operation against civilians. The discrepancy between his solitary physical life and his active digital life is the key paradox. Physically, he was a ghost, moving between rentals and gyms. Digitally, he was loud, active, and deeply embedded in a global network of hate. As we conclude this dissection, we look at the scar tissue left on Christchurch. The Al-Noor and Linwood mosques have been repaired. The bullet holes are gone. Fresh paint covers the walls, but the community is forever altered. The anatomy of resilience displayed by the survivors is profound. They refuse to leave. They return to prayer in the very rooms where their loved ones were slaughtered. but the fear remains, the knowledge that safety is fragile and that hate can arrive on a quiet Friday afternoon is a burden they now carry. The Christchurch Mosque shootings were a watershed moment. They forced the world to confront the reality that online extremism is not a virtual problem. It has a body count. The anatomy of this crime reveals a terrifying efficiency. A lone actor, empowered by loose gun laws, radicalized by algorithmic hate, and broadcasting his atrocity to a global audience, it showed us that the front line of counterterrorism is no longer just in conflict zones abroad, but in the server farms of Silicon Valley and the bedrooms of isolated young men. The sentence of life without parole removed the man from society, but it did not delete the ideology. The manifesto is still out there. The video is still out there. The echo chambers that radicalized him are still humming with activity. The anatomy of the Christchurch case is a warning. It demonstrates that in a hyper-connected world, the distance between a hateful thought posted on a message board and a bullet fired in a place of worship is terrifyingly short. The mechanism of terror has evolved. It is decentralized, digital, and viral. And while we can lock away the killer, we have yet to figure out how to lock away the hate that built him. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.